Hey everyone, tonight we're going back. We've got a Tuesday morning in a 1950s kitchen, and you will not believe how many rules there are before you touch a single pan. We've got the story of the Mixmaster, the stand mixer, that rewrote the contract between American women and their own kitchens. We have got a day in the life of a home demonstration agent, the woman who knocked on your grandmother's door selling science alongside her spry shortening. And we have got the hidden side of the spotless post-war kitchen, what the appliance advertisements never mentioned and what the gleaming linoleum was covering up. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here. And leave me a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up, and let us go back together. The alarm does not wake you, the light does. It comes in around 6 in the morning through the kitchen window, the one facing east, the one you have been meaning to put a proper curtain on since last spring. It comes in thin and yellow and strikes the linoleum just so, and the linoleum bounces it back up in a way that reaches your eyelids, even though you're still in the bedroom, still half under the blanket, still in the part of the morning that does not technically belong to anyone yet. You know better than to pretend otherwise. Your feet find the floor before your brain has fully agreed to the morning. The floor is cold. It is always cold in the kitchen in the early hour, even in June, because the linoleum does not hold warmth the way wood does, and the kitchen faces north except for that one east window, and the house was built in 1947 without much consideration for the comfort of the person who would be spending the most hours inside it. That person is you. You are spending those hours regardless. You're wearing your house coat, the blue one with the white piping around the collar, the one that's starting to fray at the left cuff in a way you have been ignoring since February. You tie the sash without looking. You have done this enough times that your hands know the knot before your eyes have properly opened. You cross the hall, you push through the kitchen door, and the day begins in the only way it ever begins in a house like this, with the kitchen. The first thing is the stove, not coffee, not the children, not your husband still sleeping upstairs, the stove. Because everything else depends on it, and the stove in a 1950s American kitchen is not the kind of appliance that wakes up quickly. It is a gas range, white enamel, 4 burners, and an oven with a pilot light that sometimes requires coaxing. You turn the left front burner to the low position and let it catch. It does, with a small sound like a breath being let out, and the blue flame sits there steady and patient while the rest of the kitchen waits. The coffee pot is already loaded. You did this last night, a habit so deep it stopped being a decision sometime in the early part of the decade. You filled the percolator with cold water from the tap, measured out the ground coffee, a generous measure because your husband drinks 3 cups before he says a word in the morning, and you have learned that the generosity of the first cup determines the temperature of the first conversation. You set the lid on, you set it on the burner, you wait. There is a rule about the waiting, though no one ever wrote it down. You do not sit, not yet. Sitting at this hour, before the coffee is made and the oatmeal is started and the children are up, is the kind of thing that makes the morning longer somehow, that makes every subsequent task heavier. You stand at the counter instead, with one hand resting on the edge of the sink, and you look out the east window at the yard, at the bird bath that needs cleaning, at the neighbour's maple that has already started thinking about fall even though it is only August, and you let your mind be quiet for the 2 minutes and 40 seconds it takes the percolator to begin its sound. The sound is particular, a low burble at first, rhythmic, almost reassuring, the kind of sound that tells you something is happening that you did not have to make happen yourself. Then it builds, becomes more insistent, and then the smell comes, and the smell is the real start of the morning. Coffee smell in a cold kitchen is one of those things that people spend the rest of their lives trying to recreate in candles and diffusers and specialty blends, and none of it is ever quite right, because the real thing was never about the coffee. It was about what the coffee meant. It meant the kitchen was running. It meant the day had started in an orderly way. It meant that the first task was complete. You have not touched a pan yet. You have not cracked an egg or opened the refrigerator or lifted the lid of the oatmeal canister. But you have already followed 3 rules that every woman you know follows without ever having discussed them. Rules that belong to the kitchen the way the kitchen belongs to the house, quietly and without argument. The first rule is heat before food. The stove goes on before anything is taken out of the refrigerator, before anything is measured or mixed or opened. The kitchen has to be warmer than the air in the rest of the house before the work of feeding people can properly begin. This is practical in the way that most kitchen rules are practical, rooted in actual consequence rather than arbitrary preference. A cold kitchen means cold fat that will not melt right, cold dough that will not rise the way it should, cold hands that fumble with jar lids and drop things and generally make the morning take longer than it needs to. The second rule is coffee first, everything else second. This one is practical too, but in a different way. The coffee takes time to make, and that time is not wasted time. It is the interval during which other preparations begin. By the time the coffee's ready, the oatmeal pot should be warming. By the time your husband has poured his first cup, his eggs should be in the pan. The coffee pot is the clock the morning runs on, and starting it before anything else means every subsequent step falls into its proper place. The third rule is that the kitchen must be presentable before anyone else sees it. Not clean in the scrubbed sense, not the way it looks after the Saturday deep cleaning when you have moved the stove out from the wall and done the space behind it, and washed the curtains and wiped down the cabinet fronts. Presentable means the dish drainer from last night is empty, which it is, because you dried the dishes before bed and put them away. Presentable means the counter is clear of everything except what is needed for breakfast. Presentable means the kitchen looks like a kitchen where a person in control of the situation is making breakfast, which you are, even at 6 in the morning when your body's operating mainly on muscle memory and the promise of coffee. You pour the first cup. You do not add anything to it yet, not the cream that is in the small pitcher on the second shelf of the refrigerator, not the sugar that is in the bowl on the counter with the lid that has a chip in it from when your older daughter knocked it off the counter last Thanksgiving. You drink the first sip plain and hot and you close your eyes for exactly 1 second, not because you are tired, although you are, but because this is the moment between the preparation of the kitchen and the feeding of the family, and it will not come again until tomorrow morning. Then you open the refrigerator. The refrigerator in 1956, the one that sits in the northeast corner of your kitchen, is a Frigidaire with a round handle and a latch that clicks when it closes. It is white on the outside and white on the inside with 3 wire shelves and a small freezer compartment at the top that frosts up faster than the manual says it should. Inside, on the top shelf, there is a quart of milk, a pound of butter in its paper wrapper, the small cream pitcher, 3 eggs left from the carton of 12, half a pan of leftover pork chops from Sunday, a bowl of potato salad covered with a plate because you have run out of the waxed paper you use to cover things, and a paper bag of apples. On the second shelf there are leftovers in bowls, a jar of grape jelly, a wedge of American cheese, and the tall pitcher of orange juice that you squeezed yesterday afternoon when the children came home from school. You take out the eggs, the butter and the milk. You take out the oatmeal canister from the shelf above the stove. You measure water into the pot, 2 cups for the children, and you set it on the burner you left on low. The rule about measuring is so embedded in the morning routine that you do not think of it as a rule at all. You think of it as simply what you do. Guessing with water and oatmeal produces lumps. Lumps produce complaints. Complaints in the morning add weight to the rest of the day that nothing quite removes. While the water heats, you open the bread box. The bread box sits on the counter to the left of the sink, a metal one with a sliding lid, and inside it there is a loaf of white bread from the day before yesterday that is still fresh enough for toast, and the heel of a loaf from last week that is beginning to go stiff in a way that means it will become breadcrumbs by the end of the day, and nothing will be wasted. The rule about wasting bread is older than your kitchen, and older than your mother's kitchen, rooted in decades of making do, and even now, even in a year when the grocery shelves are full and the family is comfortable, and there is no real reason to stretch a loaf any further than a loaf wants to go, you cannot bring yourself to throw out bread that still has use left in it. You put 4 slices in the toaster. The toaster is chrome with red plastic handles, a wedding gift from your husband's aunt in 1949, and it still works perfectly because you clean the crumb tray every Friday and wipe the outside down every morning with a damp cloth. The rule about appliances is that they last longer if you attend to them regularly, and the women who complain about their appliances are generally the women who have not been attending to them regularly, which is a thing you think but do not say, because not saying things like that is also a rule, a social one that keeps the neighbourhood running smoothly. The oatmeal water is simmering. You add the oats, a cup and a quarter, you stir once and reduce the heat, and then you turn your attention to the eggs. 4 eggs this morning, your husband has 2, and each of the children has 1. Scrambled because your son will not eat them any other way ever since the fried egg incident of last spring that no one is going to discuss again. You crack the eggs into the bowl, not the mixing bowl, the medium blue bowl that lives on the right side of the dish drainer, and that is used for eggs and only for eggs. Because the rule about bowls is that you use the right one for the right thing, and you never use the egg bowl for anything else, or you will spend the rest of your life wondering why your scrambled eggs taste slightly of whatever else went into the bowl last. You add a splash of milk, not cream milk, because cream in scrambled eggs is a thing your mother does, and your mother's eggs always come out too rich for early morning, and your husband once said so, and has been forgiven, but you have not forgotten. You beat the eggs with the fork, not the whisk the fork, because the whisk aerates them too much and they become the wrong texture in the pan. You add a pinch of salt, you add nothing else. The rule about scrambled eggs is that they are not a vehicle for other things, they are scrambled eggs, they are complete. The butter goes into the pan, the cast iron skillet that is always on the back right burner when it is not on the front left burner, and is never, under any circumstances, put in the dishwasher, because the dishwasher strips the seasoning, and a stripped cast iron skillet is a tragedy that takes months to repair. The butter melts slowly, and you tilt the pan to coat the surface, and then you pour in the eggs, and you do not touch them for 30 seconds, which is the rule that separates scrambled eggs from egg porridge. 30 seconds, then you push them gently from the outside in with the flat wooden spoon, the one that hangs on the hook to the left of the range hood, and they fold over on themselves in the way that scrambled eggs should, soft and barely set, still glossy in the centre. You turn off the burner. The rule about eggs is that you take them off the heat before they are done, because they will continue cooking in the pan, and if you wait until they look done, they will be overdone by the time they reach the table, and overdone eggs are a thing that nobody comments on directly, but that everyone notices in the way that people notice all small domestic failures, quietly and without acknowledgement, which somehow makes it worse. Your husband's footsteps on the stairs, right on time, which means it is 6:45 and you're exactly where you're supposed to be in the sequence of the morning. This is not an accident. The sequence is a thing you assembled over years of early mornings, adjusted and refined the way you adjust and refine everything in the kitchen, by trial and by the gradual understanding of what works and what makes the morning longer than it needs to be. You pour his coffee first, then yours, then you call the children. The rule about calling the children is that you call once and then you call again, and then you go to the foot of the stairs and say their names, in the voice that means the third call is the last call, and they know the difference between the voices because you have been consistent about the voices since they were old enough to understand them. Consistency is the backbone of every household rule that actually works. Rules that bend produce children who lean on them. Your daughter comes down first, which she always does, already dressed, already with her hair in its ponytail, a creature of such reliable morning efficiency that you have occasionally worried there is something wrong with her. She pours herself a glass of orange juice from the pitcher on the counter. She says good morning to her father. She sits in her chair, the second chair from the window, because the first chair from the window has the draught when the window is cracked, and she has declared herself unable to eat in a draught since she was 6 years old. Your son comes down 4 minutes later, still in his pyjama top, with his shoes on but his laces untied, in a state of preparedness so partial that it constitutes its own achievement. He pulls out his chair, the one nearest the door, the one that wobbles slightly on the left back leg in a way that has been a project waiting to be addressed for 7 months. He drinks his orange juice in 2 long swallows and holds the glass out for more without saying please. You refill the glass. The rule about the glass is that you refill it before you say anything about the please, because the lesson about the please is more effectively delivered when the child is not thirsty, and therefore has no competing agenda. You refill the glass, you put his oatmeal in front of him, you say with the particular quality of calm that is itself a form of language, that we say please when we ask for things in this house, the same way we said it yesterday and the day before. He says please. Your daughter does not look up from her oatmeal. Your husband turns the page of the newspaper. The morning is running exactly as it should. The dishes come off the stove and onto the table in the order your family has sat down to breakfast for the better part of 7 years. Your husband's plate first because he leaves earliest, then your daughter's, then your son's, then yours, which is always last and is always slightly cooler than everyone else's, which is a thing that no one in this house has ever noticed or mentioned, and which you have stopped expecting them to notice or mention, because the rule about that particular thing is that you do not make an issue of what is not meant as an issue, and the morning is not the place for grievances. You sit down, you drink your coffee. The kitchen is warm now from the stove, from the toaster, from the bodies of 4 people eating breakfast inside it, and the cold linoleum underfoot is almost pleasant against the warm air, and the east window is doing something particular with the morning light that makes the chrome toaster and the percolator and the handle of your coffee cup all glow a little more than they strictly need to. This is the moment, 3 minutes at the most, when the kitchen asks nothing of you. Everything is on the table. Everyone is eating. The stove is off. The oven has not yet been asked to do anything. The dishes will need washing afterward. The table will need wiping. And then the whole machinery of the house will begin its mid-morning sequence. The beds and the laundry and the floors and the shopping list and the phone call to your mother and the thing with the garden that has been waiting since Monday. But that is afterward. That is in a little while. Right now the kitchen is warm and the coffee is good and the family is fed, and this is the thing that none of the magazine photographs ever quite managed to capture about the 1950s American kitchen, not because the cameras were not capable of it, but because it does not photograph. It is not a look, it is a feeling. The feeling of a system that works, that you built and maintain and run every single day before the sun has properly risen, with no one watching and no one counting, and the only evidence of the effort being the fact that everyone at this table has eaten. The toast pops up, your son reaches for it immediately, you tell him it is hot, he touches it anyway, he pulls his hand back. The rule about touching hot toast is that you learn it yourself and then you know it. By 8 o'clock the table is cleared. This is not a rule so much as an inevitability, because your husband has left for work and the children have left for school, and the kitchen, which was full and warm and purposeful 20 minutes ago, is now quiet in the way that only rooms that have been recently loud can be quiet. There is a particular quality to the silence of a kitchen at 8 in the morning after a family has moved through it and out of it, a kind of settled emptiness that is different from the emptiness of a room that has not yet been used. You stand at the sink and you run hot water over the dishes and you begin to wash them in the order the rule prescribes. Glasses first, then plates, then the egg skillet, then the oatmeal pot, which always requires the most attention, because oatmeal adheres to cast iron in a way that is not immediately visible, but that reveals itself fully when you try to rinse the pot and find the residue dried to the surface, in a thin, determined layer that requires soaking and scrubbing, and a patience that is, at 8 in the morning after everything else, not always the easiest thing to summon. You soak the pot. While it soaks, you wipe the counter. The rule about the counter is that you wipe it after every meal preparation, not before the next one, after the current one, while the mess is still recent and responsive. A wiped counter is a surface that is ready for the next task, and in a kitchen like this there is always a next task. The dish towel is the one with the hand-embroidered roosters on it that your cousin made as a wedding gift and that you have used every morning since, carefully, because it is not a dish towel you want to ruin. You keep 3 dish towels on the hook beside the sink, one for daily use that can absorb real damage, one for good that comes down for company and goes back up after, and one for drying, which is only for drying and which you replace when it stops drying efficiently, which is a thing that happens gradually with towels in the way that many things happen gradually, and then all at once you notice it is not working anymore. By 8:30 the kitchen is clean, not just tidied, clean. The counter is wiped, the dishes are done, and in the rack drying, the stovetop has been wiped with a damp cloth, the table has been cleared and wiped, the floor will be done at 10 o'clock after the beds are made and the laundry is in, because the rule about the floor is that you do it after the upstairs work and before the marketing, and you do it on your knees with a rag, not with a mop, because a mop spreads dirt around more than it removes it, and you can feel the difference in your knees at the end of the day in a way that tells you the floor got clean or tells you it did not. You hang the rooster towel back on its hook. You look at the kitchen. It looks like a kitchen where no one has done anything this morning. That is the point. That is, in a way, the deepest rule of all. The kitchen must always look as if the effort was effortless, as if the family simply materialized at the table, and the food was simply there, as if the warmth came from nowhere, and the dishes washed themselves and the counter wiped its own face. The labour is invisible because the labour has been executed well enough to be invisible, and the person who made it invisible is already halfway up the stairs to make the beds. There is a word that was used during this era for the quality of a well-run kitchen, a word that appeared in home economics textbooks and in the advice columns of women's magazines, and in the cheerful copy of the appliance advertisements that showed gleaming women standing next to gleaming stoves. The word was efficiency. It was deployed with great enthusiasm by people who were not the ones being efficient. What the word never quite captured was the physicality of it. The weight of a wet laundry basket carried down the stairs. The particular ache in the lower back that develops after 2 hours of standing on linoleum. The way your hands smell after a morning of dishwater and bleach, and the kind of chemical cleaning products that came in cans and bottles with cheerful labels and that you did not think to question, because the labels were cheerful and the kitchen looked clean afterward. The way your knees feel at 10 o'clock in the morning after the floor. The women who ran these kitchens ran them the way any skilled person runs any demanding system, by learning its patterns, anticipating its failures, accommodating its quirks, and never once allowing the seams to show to anyone who was not going to notice them anyway. The rules were not rules written down somewhere. They were the accumulated wisdom of women teaching other women how to do this work in a way that looked easy and cost them considerably more than ease. Your mother taught you most of them, not as lessons, not formally, not as a curriculum, but as what you did on the mornings you were in the kitchen with her and you were old enough to be useful instead of underfoot. The rule about the egg bowl, the rule about calling the children, the rule about wiping the counter after the meal rather than before the next one. These came from watching her, from standing beside her at the sink at 7 in the morning when you were 9 years old and the world was smaller and the kitchen smelled of the same gas and coffee and toast that your kitchen smells of now. She would not have called any of it rules. She would have looked at you with a certain patient expression if you had suggested that and said, "That is just how you do it." As if there were no decision involved, as if the knowledge had been delivered rather than accumulated, as if the kitchen knew what it was doing and you merely assisted. Perhaps that was the deepest rule of all. You do not talk about the rules, you simply run the kitchen. By noon, you will have made the beds, done the laundry, swept and mopped the kitchen floor, gone to the grocery store for the 3 things you needed that were not on the weekly list, spoken to your mother on the telephone, started a pot of soup for dinner, and ironed your husband's shirts for the week which have been waiting in the laundry basket since Monday morning when they came off the line. By noon, the kitchen will have been used 3 times since breakfast, for a cup of tea at 9:30 while you caught your breath between the laundry and the beds, for the soup that started at 11, and for a quick lunch of crackers and cheese, and the last of the orange juice from the morning pitcher, which you will drink standing at the counter, because sitting down for lunch feels like something that happens to other women, women whose mornings do not run quite so full. By noon, the kitchen will look, again, as if nothing has happened in it. That is the rule. The kitchen is always ready for the next thing. The work is never finished because the work is the thing that never finishes. The family eats, and the family goes away, and the family comes back and it has to eat again, and the kitchen is there, warm and clean and ready, the way it always is, the way it has always been, the way it will be again tomorrow morning when the light comes in through the east window and finds you at the stove, already up, already working, the coffee already on. The laundry is Monday, not Tuesday, not Wednesday, not a rolling assignment based on how full the hamper is. Monday. This rule is so deeply embedded in the domestic calendar of 1950s America that deviation from it carries a social weight that is difficult to explain to anyone who did not live inside it. Hanging laundry on a line on a Thursday signals to the neighbours who can see the line from their own kitchens that something went wrong with Monday, an illness, a disruption, an emergency. The assumption is not that you simply chose Thursday. The assumption is that Monday was lost to something. You sort the laundry before breakfast, not after, because the sorting must be done while the mind is still fresh, and the categories must be respected absolutely. Whites together, colours together, delicates in their own pile, the blouses and the slips and the things that cannot go through the wringer at full tension without suffering. Woolens, if there are any this time of year, set completely aside for hand washing and cool water, with the woolite that lives on the shelf above the utility sink. You have sorted laundry so many times that your hands make the decisions before your eyes are fully engaged, directing fabric into pile without conscious assessment, the way a pianist's hands know the keys. The Maytag wringer washer is in the basement. This is a detail that distinguishes your house from the newer houses in the developments on the other side of town, where the washers are the automatic kind, the kind that fill themselves and agitate and spin and do not require you to stand beside them, feeding wet clothes through the wringer rolls at just the right angle and speed to avoid wrapping the fabric around the rollers in a way that requires assistance to remove and that sometimes damages the thing being wrung. Your Maytag has been in the basement since 1949. It works, you maintain it. You're not spending money on an automatic washer until this one gives you a genuine reason, which it has not done, and which you suspect it will not do, because a machine that was built in 1949 and has been maintained properly is a machine that intends to keep working. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. You carry the sorted piles downstairs in the rectangular laundry basket, the one with the handles that have been wrapped in electrical tape since the spring of last year when one of them cracked. You fill the Maytag's tub with hot water from the utility sink, the hottest you can get it. Because hot water is the rule for whites and you are starting with the whites. You add the Tide, the full amount, not the cautious amount that the box suggests, because the box is hedging its recommendation for people who do not know how dirty the whites actually get. You add the bluing for the sheets, the small bottle of bluing that keeps them from going yellow in the way that white cotton goes yellow when it is washed many times in water that is less than scalding. The agitator begins. You listen to it work. There is something deeply satisfying about the sound of a Maytag agitating a full load, a rhythmic churning that is purposeful and reliable, the sound of work being done that you're not currently having to do yourself. You go back upstairs. You finish clearing breakfast. You come back down at 11 minutes, which is the rule, not 10 and not 15:11, because the studies that your home economics teacher cited in 1938 have apparently held up. The wringer. The wringer is the part of the process that requires your full attention and your full body, not just your hands. You guide the wet sheet between the rollers at the angle that distributes the pressure evenly across the fabric and prevents the corners from catching and pulling. You feel the water being pressed out, the sheet coming through flattened and damp rather than soaking, lighter by the weight of what the rollers have removed. There is a particular pleasure in a perfectly wrung sheet. The efficiency of it, the completeness of it, the feeling of having extracted every drop of water that could be extracted without tearing the fabric. The line is in the backyard. You put the laundry up in the order of the week's logic, which means sheets first because sheets must be on the line long enough to dry fully before the children come home from school, then towels, then the family's clothes in the colour-sorted order that mirrors the wash order. The rule about the line is that you use enough pins, not fewer than 2 per item and more for anything heavy. The rule about spacing is that items must not touch each other, or they will take longer to dry and may show the contact mark. The rule about the clothespins is that they go back in the bag at the end and not loose in the pocket where they fall out and lie in the grass until someone mows. You finish pegging the last of the colours at 9:47. The line is full. The morning sun is reaching the backyard over the roof of the house, the angle it reaches at this time of year allowing it to hit the line for the maximum hours before the shade from the maple moves in at 2 in the afternoon. You have planned the timing of the laundry around the angle of the sun since the second summer in this house. You do not think of this as planning anymore. You think of it as what you do. Back inside, you do the floor. The rule about the floor is that you do it on your knees, with the rag mop for the general surface and the scrub brush for the grout lines between the linoleum tiles in the corner by the stove, where grease accumulates in a way that only a brush can address properly. The floor cleaner is a mix of hot water and the pine-scented cleaning liquid that comes in a green bottle, and that smells like the decision that someone made to make cleaning smell like nature rather than like cleaning. You do not dislike the smell. You are simply aware that it is a decision someone made, and you sometimes think about that decision while you are scrubbing the grout lines, which is the kind of thought that a person has when they are on their knees on a kitchen floor with nothing else to look at. The floor takes 22 minutes when you do it properly and 11 minutes when you do it fast. You almost always do it properly. Not because anyone is checking, not because there is a consequence for the 11-minute floor, but because you know the difference in the way that anyone knows the difference between doing a thing correctly and doing it well enough, and the 11-minute floor is always, faintly, at the back of the day's accounting, a thing not quite finished. By 11 o'clock the soup is on. This is the second use of the kitchen today. the first having been breakfast, the third being lunch, the fourth being dinner. The kitchen runs in shifts the way a diner runs in shifts, with the staff always the same and the customer list changing only slightly from meal to meal. The soup is the beginning of dinner, not a separate meal, not something that stands alone. It is a pork bone from Sunday's roast in a pot of cold water, brought slowly to a simmer with a bay leaf, and the rough chopped remains of the vegetables from the produce drawer that have reached the point in their life cycle where they are too far gone for salad, but not yet too far gone for soup. This is the rule about vegetables. They go to salad first, then to cooked dishes, then to soup, then to the stock pot, then to the compost at the back of the yard if anything remains, which it rarely does. The soup does not require your attention once it is simmering. This is the genius of soup, the thing that makes Monday soup and Tuesday soup and Wednesday soup not a failure of imagination, but a deliberate strategy. The strategy of a person who knows how to use what the kitchen can do without requiring the person in the kitchen to be present every moment of the doing. The soup simmers, you make the beds, you come back, the soup is still simmering. This is a collaboration between you and the stove and the pork bone, and the pork bone is doing a remarkable amount of the work. The marketing takes you out of the kitchen and into the world for 40 minutes, which is the length of time the walk to the grocery store and back requires when you factor in the wait at the butcher counter, and the conversation you will unavoidably have with Mrs. Pelton, who lives 3 blocks from the store, and who is always there on Monday mornings, and who has never once failed to have a complete opinion about the price of ground beef. You have been having this conversation with Mrs. Pelton about the price of ground beef for 4 years, and in 4 years the price of ground beef has gone in only one direction, and Mrs. Pelton's opinions about this have gone in the same direction with increasing intensity. You buy what is on the list, and one thing that was not on the list because it looked good and the price was right, a head of cabbage that will become part of the soup, if not the salad, for tomorrow's dinner. The cabbage goes in the basket with the rest. You walk home. The soup smells you before you open the door, the rich and particular smell of a long-simmered broth that has been extracting everything worth extracting from the pork bone all morning, and that smell is the best part of Monday, possibly the best part of any day that begins early and involves laundry and floors and the grout brush and the sound of Mrs. Pelton's opinions about ground beef. Lunch is quiet. Your husband is at work. The children are at school. You eat at the kitchen table, not the dining room table, because eating in the dining room alone is something that strikes you as slightly melancholy in a way you cannot fully articulate, and the kitchen is warmer and the view from the kitchen window is better, and the kitchen has the soup smell and the coffee smell and the particular lived-in warmth of a room that has been in use since 6 in the morning and that wears its use well. You eat crackers and the last of the cheese from the refrigerator's second shelf and a cup of the broth from the soup pot, ladled out carefully so as not to disturb the bone still working its way through the afternoon. You drink a glass of water. You sit for exactly the amount of time it takes to eat this lunch without rushing and without lingering, which is about 20 minutes. Then you clear your plate, rinse it, and leave it in the rack. A single plate does not merit the full dishwashing procedure. The single plate can wait until after dinner when it will be washed with the dinner dishes. This is an economy of effort that no home economics manual ever codified, but that every woman who has run a kitchen for more than a year arrives at independently, because running a kitchen is, among other things, the art of knowing which rules can flex and which ones cannot. The afternoon moves through its tasks in the order they have always moved through their tasks. The soup is strained and the bone is discarded and the broth is returned to the pot with the carrots and potatoes and the cabbage from this morning's marketing, which was not on the list because a person who writes a list in the morning does not always know what the afternoon will require. The ironing board comes up at 2:15 and the shirts come out of the damp pile where you left them rolled since coming off the line, and the iron goes on the medium setting that is correct for cotton, and you iron the shirts in the order of size. Your husband's first because they are the largest and the most demanding, and it is better to do the demanding thing when the hands are fresh. The ironing is the one part of the day you do not rush, not because you love ironing, though you have made a peace with it that resembles affection, but because ironing requires a quality of attention that produces, when it is done properly, a result that is visible and specific and unambiguous. A wrinkled shirt and a pressed shirt are different things in a way that everyone can see, and the difference is entirely attributable to whether someone spent the time with the iron. There is a satisfaction in producing results that are that legible. Your daughter comes home at 3:22, which is when she always comes home when she comes directly home, and on the day she does not come directly home, she is at her friend Patricia's house, and she calls to say so, which is the rule about after school, that you call if you're not coming directly home, a rule that was established after the incident last October that nobody is going to revisit except to say that the rule exists for a reason. Your son comes home at 3:45 and he is hungry in the way that an 11-year-old boy is always hungry in the late afternoon, which is to say completely, and without any nuance about timing or appropriateness. He goes directly to the kitchen and opens the refrigerator and looks at it for approximately 90 seconds in the way that boys look at refrigerators, as if something might appear in it that was not there the last time they looked, which was 11 minutes ago. Nothing new appears. You offer crackers and peanut butter. He takes the crackers and peanut butter and the apple from the bowl on the counter and goes to do his homework, which he will claim is done by 5 o'clock in a way that will not survive examination, but that you will choose not to examine today because today is already long enough. Dinner at 6. The rule about dinner is that it is at 6, not 6:15 and not 5:45, because dinner at 6 is the thing that holds the evening schedule together, the thing against which everything else is measured and planned. Your husband is home at 5:40. He changes his shirt. He comes to the kitchen, where the soup has been going since morning, and the bread is sliced and the salad is made, and he sets the table without being asked because this is a thing he does, has always done, has done since the first year of the marriage, when it was understood without discussion who would cook and who would clear, and that the table setting was his contribution to the production, a small thing and entirely genuine, and one of the many small things that hold a household together without anyone needing to name them. The kitchen at 6 in the evening is different from the kitchen at 6 in the morning. Fuller, louder, warmer from the soup and the bodies in it, alive with the particular noise of a family that has been in separate parts of its life all day and is now reconvening in the space where the reconvening always happens. Your son tells a story about something that happened at recess that takes 4 minutes and is punctuated by his sister's corrections at several intervals. Your husband asks a question that begins a conversation about something that happened at the plant that he simplifies for the children, and that you understand is more complicated than the simplified version, but that this is not the moment for the complicated version. You serve the soup, you serve the bread. The soup is what it should be, rich and satisfying and complete, the result of a full day's work that began with a pork bone at 11 in the morning and arrived at the table at 6 in the evening, having never required your full attention but having never been far from it. By 7:30 the dishes are done and the kitchen is clean for the 3rd time today, and the percolator is loaded for tomorrow, and the bread box is closed and the dish towels are hung, and the kitchen light is on at its lower setting, the one that is warm rather than bright, the one that means the kitchen is resting rather than working. Your husband is in the living room with the newspaper, your daughter is in her room with a book. Your son is supposed to be in his room doing the homework that was done by 5 o'clock, but that apparently requires revisiting. You stand at the kitchen window for a moment. The backyard is dark now, the laundry line empty since you brought the dry clothes in at 4:30, the bird bath invisible in the dark, the maple is a shape against the sky, the kitchen behind you is quiet and clean, and carries the smell of the soup and the coffee and the particular warm smell of a room that has been used well all day. There is no rule about this moment. This is the moment between one day and the next, between the last dish of tonight and the first cup of tomorrow, and it belongs only to you. You do not stay long. The day is done, which means it is almost time for the next one to begin its preparation, and the preparation begins with sleep, which begins with going upstairs, which begins with leaving the kitchen. You turn off the light. The kitchen goes dark. Somewhere in the dark, the percolator is loaded and ready. The bread is in the bread box. The soup pot is clean and on the hook beside the stove. Everything is in its place. Everything is ready. Tomorrow morning, the light will come in through the east window again. You will be in the kitchen before it arrives. There are rules about guests that belong to the kitchen, the same way the rules about eggs and floors and laundry belong to the kitchen. Rules that do not live in manuals and that are not taught explicitly, but that govern the conduct of the kitchen whenever the kitchen becomes visible to someone outside the family. When a neighbour comes for coffee on a Tuesday morning, the kitchen that receives her must meet a standard that is different from the standard the kitchen meets for the family's Tuesday morning. Not dramatically different, not the full company is coming standard of a dinner party, but elevated in the particular way of a kitchen that is being seen. The company as coming standard is its own education. A kitchen prepared for dinner guests in 1956 goes through a transformation in the 2 hours before the guests arrive that would not be visible to the guests themselves because its purpose is to remove all evidence of the 2 hours. The counter is cleared of its working materials and wiped with a cloth that has been dipped in warm water and the smallest amount of cleaning liquid, just enough to cut the accumulated film of cooking without leaving a smell of cleaning behind. The stovetop is wiped of anything that has accumulated during the day's preparation, which requires a particular kind of careful wiping that addresses the rings around the burners where things have boiled over without disturbing the pilot light settings. The dish drainer is emptied and the dishes put away, because a dish drainer full of drying dishes in a kitchen receiving guests is a signal that the kitchen is still in process, and a kitchen receiving guests should appear to be in a state of graceful arrival rather than ongoing preparation. The refrigerator is not generally seen by guests, and so the refrigerator's interior does not require transformation. This is one of the few rules of the company kitchen that involves a reduction of effort rather than an increase, and it is therefore a rule that the kitchen practitioner remembers with particular clarity. You do not have to clean the inside of the refrigerator before company. This knowledge sits in the category of small relief, of things that do not need to be done, which in a day that consists largely of things that do need to be done has a particular brightness. The tablecloth goes on the dining room table at 3 o'clock, which is 3 hours before dinner and early enough that any wrinkles from the storage drawer will have time to fall out of the good linen before the guests arrive. The rule about the tablecloth is that you shake it out fully before you spread it, because a tablecloth spread without shaking will carry its fold lines onto the table in a way that no amount of smoothing will completely address before dinner. You spread it from the centre, holding both ends and letting it fall evenly, and you adjust the hang on all 4 sides before you set anything on it. The setting goes on next, in the order of the silverware pattern that you received as a wedding gift and that you use twice a year, for Thanksgiving and for dinner parties, and that lives in its fitted box in the sideboard between those occasions. There is a rule about the good china that every woman who owns good china understands without having been told, which is that the good china is not insured against its own use. Every time the good china comes out, there is the possibility of loss. A plate can be dropped, a cup can crack. The gravy boat, which is always the most vulnerable piece because it is held differently from a plate, and its shape does not accommodate a firm grip, can be lost in any given dinner party, in a way that requires a response of measured grief that does not make the guests feel responsible, even when one of them was responsible. The rule about the good china is that you use it because it is beautiful, and because beautiful things should be used, and because the alternative, keeping it in the box and bringing out the everyday dishes for company, is a small defeat that says something about your relationship to the idea of occasions that you do not want to say. In the late 1920s, an engineer at the Chicago Flexible Shaft Company sat down with a problem that had been irritating him for some time. The problem was not a mechanical one, not precisely. It was more of an observational one. He had watched his wife stand at the kitchen counter and beat egg whites by hand with a rotary egg beater for 15 uninterrupted minutes. He had timed it. The process required sustained, consistent physical effort from start to finish, and there was no shortcut, no way to rest without losing the progress the whites had made toward the stiff, glossy peak that a recipe required. He had watched her arm tire. He had watched her switch arms, which required a particular grip rearrangement that cost her a full minute of good beating. He had watched the whole operation with the focused attention of a man who fixed mechanical problems for a living, and he had thought, there is something wrong here. His name was Ivar Jeppson. He was not the first person at Chicago Flexible Shaft to think about domestic motors. The company made sheep shearing equipment and was already producing a product called the Sunbeam electric iron. But Jeppson's contribution to the domestic kitchen was not incremental. It was a rethinking of the fundamental relationship between the cook and the machine. What he built, in collaboration with his colleagues and through several years of revision and refinement, was the Sunbeam Mixmaster. It arrived on the market in 1930, in the middle of the Great Depression, which made its commercial history considerably more complicated than its design history. The Mixmaster was a tilt-head stand mixer with 2 beaters and a built-in motor, and it cost $16.95, which in 1930 represented roughly 2 to 3 days of wages for an average American worker. It was, by any reasonable Depression-era standard, a luxury, and it sold. The first thing people noticed about the Mixmaster was the sound. Not the sound of the motor, which was surprisingly quiet for something with that much mechanical ambition, but the sound of it working. The sound of beaters turning in batter was a different sound than the sound of a handheld rotary egg beater, working through the same material, fuller and steadier and more assured, the sound of something doing the thing it was built to do without any variation in effort or speed. For women who had spent years with a hand beater, that steadiness was astonishing. Not because it was louder or faster, but because it was constant. It did not tire. It did not slow down when the batter thickened. It did not require you to stop and flex your fingers and shift the bowl and start again. The marketing of the Mixmaster was interesting from the beginning, and it became more interesting as the decade progressed. Sunbeam's advertisers understood something that not all appliance marketers of the era had fully grasped, which was that selling a kitchen machine to a woman meant selling it to the version of herself she most wanted to be. Not the tired version. Not the version with the aching arm at 4 p.m. trying to get a cake done before the children came home from school. The version who had time, whose kitchen ran smoothly, whose baked goods turned out reliably, whose household competence was visible and admired. The advertisements showed women who looked rested. This was not an accident. It was a specific choice made by people who understood that domestic appliances were not merely selling convenience. They were selling the possibility of a version of womanhood in which the labour was managed, if not abolished. The Mixmaster advertisement that ran in Good Housekeeping in 1934 showed a woman in a crisp apron standing at her kitchen counter, with her hand resting lightly on the top of the machine while it did its work, and she looked like a person who had time to think about other things. She looked like a person who was not tired. The machine, of course, did not make the work disappear. That is the thing that the advertisements never quite managed to say directly, though they implied it consistently. What the Mixmaster did was redistribute the effort, the beating and creaming and whipping, the tasks that required sustained mechanical output from the body, those it took entirely. The measuring, the adding, the watching, the judgment, calls about consistency and texture, and when the batter had been beaten enough, and when it had been beaten too much, those it left completely to the cook. It did not replace skill, it replaced stamina. This distinction was important, and the women who used Mixmasters early on understood it in a way that the advertisements did not always reflect. The machine gave you back the 45 minutes of standing at the counter beating something. But it did not give you back the years of knowing what properly beaten cake batter looked like, or understanding why your cream cheese frosting was graining and how to fix it, or recognizing by the sound and the feel of the bowl when your bread dough had developed enough gluten. The Mixmaster made the physical part of baking easier. It made none of the knowledge part easier. The knowledge was still yours to accumulate, the same way your mother accumulated it, by doing the thing enough times to understand what the thing was doing. By the late 1930s, the Mixmaster had become something like a standard. Not universal, because the price remained a significant barrier for many households, and because there were large portions of rural America where electricity had still not reliably arrived, and because there were women who genuinely preferred the hand beater and were not interested in being persuaded otherwise. But standard in the sense that it had become a household name in the literal way. The thing that a word for a thing becomes when the thing is so prevalent that people use the brand name as the common noun. People said Mixmaster the way they said Frigidaire for refrigerator and Hoover for vacuum. The product had achieved the particular commercial permanence that comes from being both useful and everywhere. The machine itself kept getting better. Sunbeam's engineering team worked on the Mixmaster throughout the 1930s and into the 40s and 50s with the kind of sustained attention that reflects genuine institutional commitment to a product. They refined the motor, they adjusted the bowl design, they added a juicer attachment in 1933, and a food grinder and a can opener and a potato peeler in subsequent years, so that the Mixmaster became less a single machine and more a platform, a hub to which domestic tasks could be attached in modular fashion. The bowl attachment system was its own small revolution. The Mixmaster was designed from the beginning to accept bowls of different sizes, and the bowls were intended to move on a rotating platform, so that the beaters could reach every part of the bowl, without you having to stop the machine and manually adjust the bowl's position. This sounds, from a modern perspective, like a modest convenience. From the perspective of 1931, when the alternative was a stationary bowl and a hand that kept pushing the batter away from the beaters to stop it from building up on one side and leaving the other untouched. It was a meaningful practical advance. What the Mixmaster could not do, and what no appliance could do in the 1930s or the 40s or the 50s or any other decade, was resolve the question underneath the marketing, which was the question of what all the time that was being saved was supposed to be used for. This is the question that hovered behind every labour-saving domestic appliance of the mid-20th century, like an uninvited guest at a dinner party. If the machine is doing the beating, what are you doing? And the answer, in most American households in most years of the post-war era, was that you were doing the next thing. The list of next things was not shorter because the Mixmaster existed. It was, if anything, longer, because the advent of appliances that reduced the time required for specific tasks often resulted in elevated expectations about the number of tasks that could reasonably be accomplished. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. This is documented not just in social history but in the practical evidence of cookbooks. The cookbooks of the 1930s were ambitious in a way that assumed hand tools and considerable time. The cookbooks of the 1950s, written for and by women who owned Mixmasters and Frigidaires and automatic ovens, were more ambitious still. The number of courses expected at a dinner party increased. The complexity of the desserts increased. The frequency with which baked goods were assumed to appear on the family table, not just on birthdays and holidays but on ordinary Tuesdays, increased. The machine did not reduce the work, it raised the ceiling on what the work was expected to produce. The company that made the Mixmaster, which had become Sunbeam Corporation by the mid-20th century, navigated the post-war consumer economy with the particular confidence of an organisation that believed its product was essential. And for a very long time the evidence supported that belief. Mixmasters appeared on wedding registries and were given as shower gifts, and handed down from mothers to daughters, and turned up at estate sales with their original attachments still neatly stored in the original box, which is itself a kind of testimony to the durability of the machine and the reverence with which it was kept. The machine that Ivar Jeppsson designed in the late 1920s was made to run for a long time, and it did. There are Mixmasters from 1933 and 1941 and 1957 that still work, still turn, still beat and cream and whip with the same steady sound that first distinguished them from the handheld rotary beater in the kitchens of women whose arms were tired and whose kitchens were about to change. The change was real. The exhaustion in the arm, the particular ache of 15 minutes of sustained hand beating, the way that effort accumulated across a baking day, all of that genuinely diminished. What did not diminish, and what the cheerful advertisements with their rested-looking women never quite addressed, was the fact that a kitchen in which one of the physical demands had been reduced was a kitchen that would find new ways to fill the time with new expectations and new tasks and new standards that the labour-saving device had made it theoretically possible to meet. The Mixmaster is still made. It has changed considerably, as all things change over the decades, but the fundamental design logic that Jeppsson worked out in the late 1920s, the tilt head, the rotating bowl, the interchangeable attachments, the motor that does not tire, that logic persists in the machines that sit on kitchen counters today. They are heavier now, and more powerful, and available in colours that a 1930s housewife would find extravagant. But when the beaters come down into the bowl and the motor starts and the batter begins to move in the particular way that properly beaten batter moves, the sound is not so different from what it was in 1930. Steady and consistent, assured. The sound of something doing the thing it was built to do. The arm that used to do that work remembers, or rather the body that carries the arm remembers, in the way that all bodies carry the memory of work they were once required to do and are no longer asked for. The Mixmaster did not make American women less capable of beating egg whites by hand. It made the question of whether they needed to a different kind of question. And the answer that most of them chose, given the option, was no. No, they did not need to. They had a machine. And the machine was on the counter, and the counter was clean, and the kitchen was ready for the next thing, the way the kitchen was always ready. Because the kitchen was always ready, and the work was always waiting, and the eggs were not going to beat themselves. Sunbeam would eventually face the competitive pressures that face all manufacturers of consumer goods, the arrival of cheaper alternatives, the shifting priorities of a consumer culture that moved fast and valued novelty. But the Mixmaster's particular contribution to American domestic life was already complete before any of that competition arrived. It had already changed what a Tuesday afternoon in a kitchen looked like. It had already made certain kinds of effort invisible. It had already convinced an entire generation of American women that the machine was a partner in the kitchen work, even if the partnership was not always an equal one. The machine worked. The women kept working. The kitchens ran. That is what the advertisements were selling, and in that particular respect they were telling the truth. Before the Mixmaster, there was the hand-cranked egg beater, and before that there was the fork, and before that there was the hand itself, and the history of kitchen labour is in many ways the history of the progressive outsourcing of physical effort to increasingly clever mechanical arrangements. The rotary egg beater that preceded the Mixmaster was itself a significant advance over the fork and the hand, allowing the cook to apply rotary motion through a gear mechanism that translated a relatively modest crank input into rapid beater rotation. But the rotary egg beater required two things simultaneously: the cranking hand and the stabilizing hand, and it required both of them at all times, which meant that while the beaters were turning, nothing else in the kitchen could happen. This is the thing that Ivar Jeppson's design fundamentally changed. The Mixmaster was freestanding. Once you had set the beaters in the bowl and turned the machine on, your hands were free. You could measure flour while the butter and sugar were creaming. You could grease the pan while the batter was coming together. You could wipe the counter, check the oven, answer a child's question, pour yourself a cup of coffee. The machine was doing the beating, and it would keep doing the beating at the exact same speed and pressure indefinitely, which is something no human arm can do. The freedom of the hands was not incidental to the Mixmaster's appeal. It was the primary appeal, though the advertising of the early years did not always name it directly. The advertisements showed women looking pleased and engaged in their kitchens, but what they were showing, underneath the gleaming surfaces and the expressions of domestic satisfaction, was the possibility of parallel processing. A cook with a freestanding mixer could do two things at once. The kitchen that had previously required sequential execution of tasks now permitted overlap. Time that had been purely mechanical could become cognitive, or social, or simply restful. The timing of the Mixmaster's arrival is worth holding in mind. It was 1930. The country was in the early months of what would become the worst economic depression in its history. Unemployment was rising rapidly toward the figures that would characterize the middle years of the decade. The idea of spending $16.95 on a kitchen machine was, in any rational economic analysis, absurd for most households. And yet the Mixmaster sold. It sold steadily through the early years of the Depression, and while it was never the mass-market product that cheaper goods were, it maintained a commercial foothold that speaks to something important about the psychology of economic hardship. When money is scarce, people do not simply stop spending. They spend with greater deliberation on things that are either essential or that represent a durable improvement in the conditions of daily life. The Mixmaster, for households that could afford it, represented both. It was a machine that would last for decades and that would make a consequential portion of the daily domestic work faster and more reliable. The years between 1930 and 1940 were years in which Sunbeam refined the machine without changing its fundamental design logic. The motor became more powerful, the bowl design was improved, the number of speed settings increased, but the core idea, a freestanding electric mixer with interchangeable bowls and a tilting head that allowed you to raise and lower the beater assembly without removing the bowl, remained constant. Jeppson and his team had gotten the architecture right from the beginning, which is rarer than it sounds. Most consumer products go through periods of substantial redesign as manufacturers discover what was wrong with the original concept. The Mixmaster went through periods of refinement because the original concept was right. By the time the war ended and the American economy turned its enormous productive capacity toward the domestic consumer market, the Mixmaster was positioned to benefit from a cultural moment that it had helped to create. The post-war American housewife, the figure who would dominate advertising imagery and cultural aspiration for the next 2 decades, was understood to inhabit a kitchen equipped with modern appliances, and the stand mixer was among the central appliances of that kitchen. It was on the wedding registry. It was given as a shower gift. It appeared in the feature spreads of Better Homes and Gardens and Good Housekeeping and Ladies' Home Journal. as a naturally occurring feature of the modern kitchen, the way the refrigerator and the electric range appeared, as a given, an assumption, a part of the domestic landscape that required no justification. The competitors arrived. Hamilton Beach, which had been making food preparation equipment since the early part of the century, introduced its own stand mixers. KitchenAid, which had been producing commercial and then domestic mixers since the 1920s, refined its product through the same post-war decade. The market for stand mixers grew large enough to accommodate multiple competitors, which is itself a measure of how fully the machine had been absorbed into American domestic life. It was no longer a luxury the way it had been in 1930. It was something that you expected your kitchen to have, the way you expected the kitchen to have a refrigerator and a range. The attachments were the Mixmaster's particular genius as a platform. The base machine, with its motor and its mixing heads, was the starting point. What Sunbeam offered in addition was a modular system of capabilities that could be added to that base, each one connecting to the same power source and existing inside the same product ecosystem. The juice extractor connected to the mixer's hub and allowed you to juice citrus in quantity at a speed no hand-operated juicer could approach. The food grinder connected and turned the Mixmaster into a meat grinder of genuine capacity. The shredder and slicer connected. The can opener connected. The ice cream freezer connected. The dream that Sunbeam was selling with the attachment system was the dream of the integrated kitchen, in which a single motor served multiple purposes, and the investment in the base machine multiplied in value with each additional capability. This was a genuine promise, not a false one. A household that owned the Mixmaster and the full attachment suite had, in a single machine, the mechanical output of what had previously required a collection of hand tools and considerable time. The attachment system worked, people bought it, and then, for the most part, they used 3 of the attachments regularly and put the others in a drawer or a cabinet, where they remained until the next time someone thought about them, which was occasionally at a garage sale when they turned up in a box labelled assorted kitchen items, $2 for the lot. The domesticity of the post-war era carried with it a particular relationship to machinery that is worth understanding on its own terms. The women who bought Mixmasters and used them were not passive recipients of a corporate vision. They were people with strong opinions about what their kitchens needed and how their equipment should perform, and they communicated those opinions through the only channels available to them in the 1940s and 1950s, through return and replacement decisions, through the word-of-mouth networks of neighbourhoods and church groups and club meetings, through letters to the editors of women's magazines, and through the aggregate purchasing decisions that shaped what appliance manufacturers made and how they made it. Sunbeam listened, in the way that successful manufacturers of consumer goods must listen, not always quickly and not always gracefully, but consistently enough to maintain its market position. When women found the bowls difficult to remove, the bowl design changed. When women found certain attachments awkward to install, the attachment mechanism was revised. The product evolved in response to the population using it, which is a form of collaboration that no one in the corporation would have described as such, but that was, in practice, exactly what it was. The Mixmaster's legacy in American domestic history is not a story about a machine. It is a story about time, and what happens when time that was previously consumed by physical labour is returned to the person who was performing that labour. In the case of the American housewife of the 1940s and 1950s, the answer to what she did with the time was almost invariably that she used it to do more, better, more frequently, more baking, more elaborate meals, more consistent quality, more of the things that the presence of the machine had made theoretically achievable. There is no tragedy in this. The women who ran these kitchens were not victims of the machines they used. They were practitioners of a skilled domestic craft who found in the Mixmaster and its contemporaries a set of tools that expanded their capacity and raised their output without fundamentally changing the nature of the work. The work was still theirs. The judgment was still theirs. The knowledge accumulated over years of baking and cooking and adjusting and learning was still theirs, and no machine could take it or replace it. What the machine could do, and did, was make that knowledge productive in a way that hand tools alone could not. A woman who knew exactly what perfectly beaten egg whites looked like could produce them every time with the Mixmaster, at the correct texture and stability, without the variation that came from arm fatigue and timing inconsistency. A woman who knew the recipe for a 7-minute frosting could make it reliably with the mixer, which could sustain the beating speed that the recipe required without slowing. The machine amplified skill. It did not replace it. This is the distinction that the advertisements never quite managed to articulate, because articulating it would have required acknowledging that the machine was a tool and not a solution, that it was useful only in the hands of someone who knew what they were doing, that the knowledge and the judgment and the years of practice that distinguished a good cook from an indifferent one were not included in the box. The machine was for sale. The skill was not. And the machine without the skill produced consistently the wrong thing at the wrong time in the wrong texture, regardless of how gleaming the chrome and how steady the motor. The question of who actually used the Mixmaster in the American home of the 1950s is more interesting than the advertisement suggested, because the answer was not always the housewife the advertisements depicted. In households where the kitchen was shared, where a mother-in-law was present, where an older daughter was learning to cook, where a father had unexpectedly strong opinions about the texture of his Sunday pancakes, the stand mixer on the counter was a shared resource around which domestic negotiations quietly occurred. The machine had a natural authority. You did not casually override someone's use of the Mixmaster. It was too present, too purposeful, too much of a commitment to the task at hand. The sound of the Mixmaster became part of the acoustic landscape of the American kitchen. One of those background sounds that people who grew up in houses with them recall decades later with a specificity that bypasses the ordinary memory and arrives somewhere closer to sense memory. The particular pitch of the motor at the high setting, the way it changed when the batter thickened and the machine was working harder, the sound of the beaters against the side of the bowl when you had not quite centered them properly, these are sounds that live in the bodies of people who stood in those kitchens as children, watching their mothers or their grandmothers work, and that surface unpredictably when those people hear a comparable sound in a contemporary kitchen. Mothers taught daughters to use the Mixmaster the way they taught them most kitchen skills, not in formal sessions with established curricula, but through proximity and participation, through the natural apprenticeship of a kitchen, where the doing was always happening and the watching was always available. You learned by standing beside the bowl and being told to hold the vanilla, to pour the flour slowly, to not put your fingers near the beaters when the machine was running, which was a rule stated so early and so firmly that it became part of the foundational architecture of kitchen safety knowledge, alongside the rules about hot handles and boiling water and the sharp edge of the bread knife. The Mixmaster also became a marker of domestic aspiration in the way that expensive and useful things sometimes do, a signal not just of practical equipment, but of a certain kind of household seriousness about the domestic enterprise. A kitchen with a Mixmaster on the counter was a kitchen where baking happened regularly. A kitchen where baking happened regularly was a kitchen where someone was running things at a high level of domestic commitment. The machine on the counter was visible to everyone who walked into the kitchen, which in the kitchen-centric domestic culture of the 1950s meant that it was visible to guests, to neighbours who came for coffee, to the family of the person you were dating before you became the person they married. There is a particular sentence that appears in the reminiscences of people who grew up in American households of the 1950s and 1960s with some regularity, and it goes approximately like this. My mother's Mixmaster is still in the box in her basement and it still works, or a version of it. My grandmother left her Mixmaster to me, and I bake with it every Christmas. The durability of these machines was extraordinary by the standards of the disposable consumer economy that succeeded the era of their manufacture, and that durability is itself a form of testimony about what they were built to be. They were built to be used and to last, and they were both, and the ones that survive in family kitchens and estate sales and the occasional antique shop represent a kind of material continuity that is not so easy to find in the products of subsequent decades. The Mixmaster's chrome surface aged in a particular way. It did not rust because chrome does not rust, but it developed the micro-scratches of long use and the patina of kitchen air, a slight dimming of the original high gloss that turned it from shiny to handsome in the way that well-made things age when they're used regularly and cared for consistently. The chrome could be polished back to something close to its original condition, and many women polished it as part of the kitchen's regular maintenance, the same way they polished the percolator and wiped down the toaster, not because the machine needed it to function, but because a clean machine was part of a clean kitchen. And a clean kitchen was the standard the kitchen was held to. The bowls were ceramic in the early models and aluminum in later ones, and the ceramic bowls in particular became objects of some affection in the households that had them. They were heavy and smooth and slightly cool to the touch in the way that ceramic is cool, and they sat in the rotating bowl holder with a satisfying fit that suggested they had been designed for exactly this purpose, which they had. Women who have written about cooking in the 1950s describe the Mixmaster bowl with a specificity that makes clear it was a real presence in the kitchen, not just a functional component, but a thing in itself, a bowl that had its particular weight and its particular feel, and that you handled with a respect that transcended its utility. This is the quality that the history of domestic appliances most consistently underestimates. The relationship between a person and the tools they use every day is not simply instrumental, it accumulates associations. The Mixmaster bowl was the bowl in which the birthday cake batter was made, and the Christmas cookie dough, and the bread dough on Sunday morning, and the meringue for the lemon pie that your daughter asked for every year for her school graduation dinner. The bowl held the weight of all of those occasions. The machine held all of that use. And when someone eventually opens the box in the basement and lifts out the Mixmaster and plugs it in, and it still works, what they are holding is not just a machine. They are holding the accumulated kitchen life of a person they loved. You park the car 2 houses down, not in front of the house itself, because parking directly in front of the house you are calling on can feel aggressive, can feel like something has arrived uninvited and taken up space before anyone agreed to it. You have learned this. You have learned a great many things in the 2 years you have been doing this work, things that no one told you and that no manual covered, things that came from the accumulating evidence of 217 house calls in 14 months across 3 counties in a region of Middle Ohio where the soil is good and the families are careful with their money, and nobody opens the door to a stranger without first assessing the stranger through the curtain. You turn off the engine, you sit for a moment in the car, which is a 1952 Ford in a sensible dark green, and you go through your materials. The demonstration kit is in the back seat, in the flat case that you latch shut before every drive because the last time you did not latch it shut, the case slid off the seat at a stop sign, and the spray can rolled under the front seat, and you had to reach back there with your arm while you were pulling out of a gas station, and it was not a dignified situation. The kit contains, in its specific order, the small can of spry vegetable shortening, the measuring cups in their graduated set, the card recipe file with the 15 standard demonstration recipes, tabbed with the colour-coded system you developed yourself because the company system made no sense, the small notebook that serves as your record book, the company brochures in their folder, the sample packets, 7 of them today because this is a neighbourhood call, and 7 is the right number for a group that runs between 4 and 8 women depending on who can get away from the children and whether the Hendersons are back from their sisters, the carbon paper for the receipts, and the pencils, 4 of them, because 1 is never enough and 3 is somehow never quite enough either. You check your hat in the rearview mirror, you check your lipstick, you check the collar of your blouse, which is a pale yellow and which you pressed this morning before anything else, because you have learned that the collar is the first thing people look at after the face, and the collar tells them whether the person they are about to invite into their kitchen is the kind of person whose kitchen looks like theirs, or the kind of person whose kitchen looks better than theirs, and you need to be the latter without being threatening about it. The hat is straight, the lipstick is good, the collar is perfect. You get out of the car, you retrieve the case from the back seat, and you walk the 2 houses to the front door of Mrs. Eleanor Farwell, who called the company's regional office on Tuesday and arranged this appointment, and who has 3 neighbours coming over at 2 o'clock, and who made a point of mentioning when she spoke to the regional office that she has been baking with lard all her life and sees no reason to change. This is information. You think about it as you walk the sidewalk. The door opens before you knock. Mrs. Farwell has been watching from the window, which means she's been thinking about this appointment since at least noon. She's in her early 40s, wearing a good house dress in a blue print that tells you she changed into it for the occasion, and is perhaps slightly uncertain about whether changing for a product demonstration was the right call, or whether it makes her look like she was expecting something more important. You smile at her, not the full professional smile, not yet, but the warm arriving neighbour smile, the one that says I'm glad to be here, and I'm not here to judge you and your lard is not in any danger from me. She opens the door wider. You come in. The house smells of a morning's worth of coffee and the faint, warm, slightly sweet smell of something baked this week. A pie crust or a biscuit or something in that direction. The living room is tidy. The kitchen is behind it, and she is leading you toward it. And as you walk through, You're doing the assessment that you do in every kitchen before you open the demonstration case. A fast and thorough reading of the kitchen that tells you who you are talking to and what you are going to say. The kitchen is clean and organised in a way that shows long habit rather than special preparation. The counter has a canister set in a matching pattern, 4 of them, flour, sugar, coffee, tea, each one labelled in the hand of someone who considered the label carefully before writing it. The stovetop is a gas range, 8 years old approximately, well maintained, no grease on the backsplash. The icebox is in the corner, the older model, a real icebox which tells you that this household has not yet made the transition to an electric refrigerator, which is useful information about where this family sits in the continuum of domestic modernisation. The calendar on the wall is from the Grange, which tells you something about the community the family's embedded in. The dish rack beside the sink has a small hand towel hung carefully over the edge. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The bread box is on the counter with a hand-stitched cover over it, the kind that keeps flies off in the summer. There are 3 kinds of things in this kitchen. Things that were bought, things that were made, and things that were kept because they still work. You are going to sell something that fits into all 3 of those categories, and you know it. The other women arrive, 2 of them at 2:15 together and 1 more at 2:25, and they're all of a kind with Mrs. Farwell, practical and neighbourly, and slightly amused by the situation, and not at all certain they're going to be talked into anything. This is the usual configuration. You arrange the chairs that Mrs. Farwell has pulled into a loose semicircle around the kitchen table, where you have set up the demonstration space with the kit open and the measuring cups laid out, and the spry can in its position of prominence at the centre, flanked by the recipe cards on the left and the brochures on the right. You do not start with the product. This is the first rule that the regional training manual got wrong. The training manual said, begin by introducing the product and its key qualities. The training manual was written by men who had never been in a kitchen with 4 slightly sceptical Ohio women at 2 in the afternoon when one of them still has the ironing to finish and another is calculating how long she can stay before she has to start dinner. You start with the biscuits. You ask Mrs. Farwell if she has a biscuit cutter you could borrow, and she does. Of course she does. Everyone has a biscuit cutter, and the act of asking to borrow it rather than producing one from your kit does 2 things simultaneously. It respects her kitchen as the kitchen and positions you as a guest in it rather than an occupant of it. And it gives her a role, a useful one, a role that cost her no commitment and provides her with a small pleasure, the pleasure of being helpful in her own space on her own terms. She produces the biscuit cutter. It is an older one, tin, with a handle that has been rewrapped with tape at some point in its life. You say, with complete honesty, that you love an old biscuit cutter, that the newer ones do not cut as cleanly. She looks at you with an expression that is recalibrating slightly. You have the flour and the spry and the milk and the salt and the baking powder already measured into the small bowls you brought from the kit, because a kitchen demonstration that requires you to search for measuring spoons in someone else's kitchen is a kitchen demonstration that loses its momentum and its authority. The preparation is invisible because you prepared it before you arrived. This is one of the things the training manual did get right, though it expressed it poorly. It said, always have your materials ready. What it meant was, never let them see you improvise. You mix the biscuits. You talk while you mix, not about spry, not yet, but about biscuits, about the specific quality that makes a good biscuit, and the specific qualities of shortening that contribute to it. And as you talk, you are using the vocabulary that you have developed over 2 years of doing this work, the vocabulary that is technical enough to be informative and accessible enough to be conversational. You say things like fat coats the flour particles and prevents gluten development, which is why a biscuit made with lard tends to be tender, and a woman in a house like this knows what gluten development means. She has felt it in overworked dough. She has produced biscuits that were tough when she meant them to be tender. She knows exactly what you're talking about, even if she has never heard it described in those terms. Then you say, vegetable shortening produces the same effect but with a higher smoke point and a more consistent fat content, which means your biscuits will turn out more reliably from batch to batch, regardless of the temperature of your kitchen or the humidity in the air. You are not lying, this is accurate. Spry, which is a vegetable shortening made by Lever Brothers, and introduced in 1936 as a competitor to Procter & Gamble's Crisco, does in fact produce a consistent, reliable biscuit. You have made it yourself enough times in enough different kitchens on enough different days to know this is true, and the truth of it is one of the reasons you are able to sell it with the confidence you bring to every kitchen. The biscuits go in Mrs. Farwell's oven at 238. You have timed this correctly, the way you always time it correctly, because the timing is not accidental. The biscuits need 12 minutes at the temperature you've set, and those 12 minutes are the demonstration. While the biscuits bake, you talk about the other properties of vegetable shortening, about its shelf stability compared to lard, which can go rancid in a warm kitchen in summer, about its performance in pie crust, about the way it behaves in cake frosting, about the fact that it produces a white, firm frosting that holds its shape better than butter in a warm room. The women are listening, not because you have captured them, not yet, but because the oven is on and there is the smell of something baking, and the kitchen is warm and it is 2:30 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and this is objectively more interesting than the ironing. You produce the recipe cards. You have brought 15, though you will only use 5 or 6 today, because 15 recipe cards is overwhelming and 5 is generous. You choose based on the kitchen you assessed when you came in. The kitchen that told you this is a family that bakes twice a week, that uses 4 different canisters of dry goods and keeps them properly labelled, that has the kind of organised pantry that can accommodate new products without chaos. You choose the recipes that are already close to what this family cooks, close enough to be familiar, different enough to be worth trying. At 2:50, the biscuits come out of the oven. They are good biscuits. You knew they would be, because you mixed them right and the oven is at the right temperature and Mrs. Farwell's biscuit cutter is, as you said, excellent. They are golden on top, properly risen, with the layered look that comes from a dough that was handled correctly, not overworked, cut cleanly, and placed in the pan with enough space between them to rise freely. You cut one open at the table and it is white inside, with the interior texture that the biscuit instruction books call flaky, but that is actually closer to layered. A structure of thin sheets of cooked dough with air between them that collapses gently when you press it and springs back when you release it. You put them on the plate that Mrs. Farwell has ready, because she had a plate ready, because she's a woman who would not have her guests eating biscuits from a pan, and you say nothing about the biscuits for a long moment. You let the moment carry the weight, the smell and the heat and the particular pleasure of a biscuit that worked. Then Mrs. Gerhard, the woman sitting to Mrs. Farwell's left, says, "Those are very nice." And you say, "They are, and it was the spry that made the difference, and here is why," and you spend exactly 90 seconds on the why, because 90 seconds is the right amount of time to explain something credibly without losing people to the ironing. You sell 2 cans of spry that afternoon, to Mrs. Gerhard and to the woman who arrived at 2:25, whose name turns out to be Doris Kleinfelter, and who has been dissatisfied with her pie crusts for as long as she can remember. Mrs. Farwell takes 3 recipe cards and says she'll think about it, which you have learned, in 2 years of house calls, means approximately a 40% likelihood of a sale within the following 30 days, often by telephone to the regional office, sometimes by asking for you by name when the regional office next calls to schedule in her neighbourhood. You thank her for having you. You help Mrs. Farwell put the chairs back. You rinse the bowls you used from your kit in her sink and dry them with your own cloth before putting them away, because you do not use your hostess's dish towels for your own equipment. This is not a company rule. It is your rule. The difference between a company rule and your rule is that your rules make the sale, and the company rules describe what you do afterward. You walk back to the car with the case. The afternoon light is already starting to angle in the way it angles in late summer, long and golden and slightly melancholy, the light of a day that has decided it has done enough and is beginning to think about evening. You put the case in the back seat. You get in the car. You open the record book and write, "Farwell, Eleanor. Thursday call. 2 sold. 2 recipe cards taken. 1 pending. Farwell estimate 30 days. You underline Farwell, not because she is important specifically, though everyone is important specifically in this work, but because you have learned to track the undecided ones with the same attention you give to the easy ones. The easy ones sell themselves. The undecided ones sell themselves too, eventually, if you have done the work correctly and the biscuits were good, and the recipe card was the right recipe card for the right kitchen. You start the car. You have 2 more calls this afternoon, one at 4 and one at 4:45, both scheduled in advance, both households you have not visited before. The 4 o'clock is a younger wife, recently married, living in a new house in the development on the east side of town, the kind of house with a modern kitchen and a Frigidaire, and an oven that has a timer built into it. The 4:45 is a farm wife who called the regional office herself, and whose name the regional office operator noted with the notation, has tried Spry, did not love it, wants to talk. This is, in your experience, the most promising kind of call. A woman who has tried something and did not love it is a woman who knows what she wants and has not yet found it. That is a conversation you are very good at having. That is a kitchen you have been in many times, a kitchen where something has not quite worked and the woman in it is waiting, without fully knowing she is waiting, for someone to explain what went wrong and how to fix it. You pull out of the parking space and you drive toward the 4 o'clock. The work you are doing is not what you expected when you took the position 2 years ago. You expected sales, you got that. But what you also got, what you did not anticipate and what no one described to you in the regional training session that lasted 2 days in a church basement in Columbus, was the depth of what a kitchen demonstration actually is. It is not selling shortening. Anyone can sell shortening. It is reading a kitchen and the woman who runs it and understanding, in the 15 seconds between the front door and the kitchen table, what that woman needs to hear and what she needs to see and what she needs to eat, before she will consider any change to the system she has built and maintained and run with the particular skill of someone who has done it long enough to stop thinking about it as skill. It is understanding that you are not asking her to trust Spray, you are asking her to trust you, and you can only earn that in a kitchen, with your hands in the dough, with the biscuit cutter she handed you, with the 12 minutes of oven heat and the smell and the moment when the biscuits come out and you say nothing and the biscuit says everything. The 4 o'clock runs long because the young wife has questions about frosting, and you have answers, and it turns into a conversation about layer cake, and by the time it is over, she has purchased 2 cans and taken the full set of 15 recipe cards, and asked when you will be back in the neighbourhood. You tell her in about 6 weeks, and she writes it in the small calendar on her counter, in the careful handwriting of someone who has just started a household and is building its systems from the beginning, deciding which things go where and which rules are her rules and how the kitchen is going to run from now on. You watch her write it down. You think about her kitchen in 6 weeks, in 6 months, in 6 years, how the counter will look and what will be in the canisters and whether the frosting will have worked. You hope it works. You genuinely hope it works, which is the thing that distinguishes the good demonstration agents from the ones who do not last in this work. The ones who do not last care about the sale. The ones who last care about the kitchen. They care about whether the biscuits were good, whether the recipe card made sense, whether the woman who took it understood what it was asking her to do and had everything she needed to do it. The 4:45 is better still. The farm wife's name is Vera, and she has strong opinions about shortening and about what went wrong with her previous attempt at Spry pastry. And her opinions are not wrong. She overworked the dough, she used too much water, she did not account for the fact that her kitchen runs warm in the afternoon, and warm fat behaves differently from cold fat in a pastry application. You work through it, with her at her kitchen table, and by the end of an hour she understands exactly what happened and how to prevent it, and she has not bought anything, because you have not asked her to buy anything, because you know that Vera is not the kind of woman who makes a decision in an afternoon with a stranger at her table. But she has your card, and she has listened to you, and in 3 weeks she will call the regional office and ask for you by name, and you will come back and you will sell her a can of Spry and she will use it right this time, and the crust will be what she wanted it to be, and she will tell her neighbour, who will call the regional office, and the neighbour will tell her neighbour. This is the work. This is how it moves. Not through advertisements, not through the cheerful copy in the women's magazines, but through kitchens, one at a time, through the hands of women who know their own kitchens better than any advertisement does, and who will only trust what they can see work in front of them. You drive home in the late afternoon, the record book on the passenger seat, 2 sales and 2 recipe card distributions, and 1 pending and 1 cultivated relationship that will turn into something within the month. You're tired in the pleasant way that comes from a day of work that required all of you, your attention and your knowledge and your ability to read a room and adjust and recover and sell not just the product, but the confidence to use it. Tomorrow you have 4 calls, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, in a different neighbourhood, in kitchens you have not yet read. You are looking forward to it. The home demonstration business was not invented by Spry or by Lever Brothers, and it was not invented by Procter & Gamble's army of Crisco agents who had been working American kitchens since the early 19-teens. The business model of the house call, the demonstration, the recipe card, the sale completed in someone's kitchen at someone's kitchen table, was a feature of American domestic commerce that preceded the automobile and the modern road network. Before there were demonstration agents driving dark green Fords through Middle Ohio, there were peddlers and drummers and travelling salesmen moving through the countryside with their wagons, selling things at the back door because the back door was where commerce happened in a household where the front was for receiving and the back was for working. What changed in the 20th century, and what the Spry demonstration program reflected, was the professionalisation and feminisation of this kind of domestic sales work. The agent who knocked on your door in the 1940s and 1950s was not a peddler. She was a trained representative of a national company, carrying materials produced by a professional marketing department, following protocols developed by home economists, and authorised to make transactions on behalf of an organisation with a significant budget and a carefully maintained brand identity. She was a salesperson in the full professional sense, and she was almost always a woman. This was not accidental. The companies that employed home demonstration agents understood that the transaction they were asking for, the modification of a woman's established kitchen practice, required trust, and trust in a kitchen, in a world where the kitchen was the centre of a woman's domestic authority and professional identity, was more readily extended to another woman than to a man in a suit with a briefcase. The demonstration agent was a colleague, or at least she presented herself as one, another woman who worked in kitchens and understood what the kitchen required, and who was there not to sell you something you did not need, but to show you something you had not tried yet. The recipe card was the central artifact of this transaction, not the shortening itself, not the brochure, not even the demonstration, the recipe card. Because what the recipe card represented, more than the product it promoted, was a relationship. A card that told you how to make biscuits with Spry shortening was a card that assumed you were going to make biscuits. It assumed you had a kitchen, and a biscuit cutter, and an oven that worked, and the time and inclination to bake, and it assumed that you were the kind of person who uses recipe cards and files them somewhere accessible, and refers back to them when the task comes around again. It was a card addressed to a competent practitioner of a skilled domestic art, and being addressed that way was itself a form of respect that the transaction carried. The demonstration agents who worked for Spry and for Crisco and for Fluffo and for the other shortening brands that competed through the kitchen call method in the middle decades of the 20th century were not, as a rule, selling to women who had never heard of vegetable shortening. They were selling to women who had strong opinions about shortening and who had often already tried the competing product and formed a view. The sale was therefore rarely a simple one. It was a negotiation between an established practice and a proposed alternative, and the demonstration agent's job was to make the case for the alternative in the language of the established practice, using the vocabulary and the methods and the standards that the woman in the kitchen already held. This required genuine knowledge, not performed knowledge, not the glossy surface of someone who had read the brochure, but the real knowledge of someone who had made biscuits in 100 different kitchens in 100 different conditions, and knew why the biscuits sometimes came out wrong and what to do about it. The demonstration agents who lasted in this work were the ones who had this knowledge, who could diagnose a pie crust problem from a description, or identify the issue with a cake that came out flat from the way the woman described what she had done. They were, in the fullest sense, home economists, practitioners of a craft that combined the domestic arts with the communication skills required to teach them to strangers. The training varied by company and by era. Some programs were rigorous, involving weeks of instruction and supervised demonstrations before an agent was sent out alone. Others were more informal, relying on the experience the agent brought with her from her own domestic life and supplementing it with product knowledge and sales technique. In all cases, the expectation was that the agent could bake, and could bake in someone else's kitchen, with someone else's equipment at an unpredictable temperature in front of an audience that was simultaneously curious and skeptical. The skepticism was not unfriendly, but it was real. A woman who had been making biscuits with lard for 20 years, and whose biscuits had pleased her family and her guests for 20 years, was not going to change her method, because someone knocked on her door with a can of Spry and a set of recipe cards. She was going to change her method, possibly, if the biscuits that came out of her own oven at 2:30 in the afternoon on a Thursday were noticeably better than the ones she had been making. Better in a way she could taste and assess herself, using her own biscuit cutter and her own pan in her own oven. The agent's job was to create the conditions for that noticeably better biscuit, and the conditions required the agent to be right. Not approximately right, not close enough to be dismissed as a coincidence. Right. The women who did this work for years describe it, in the accounts that survive, with a consistency that is itself revealing. They describe the satisfaction of a kitchen where the product worked. They describe the specific pleasure of the moment when a skeptical woman tastes a biscuit or a pie crust, and the expression on her face changes, not the dramatic change of someone who's been converted, but the quieter change of someone who is recalibrating, who is thinking, yes, that is better, and I can see why, and possibly I will try this. They describe the relationship between the agent and the kitchen as collaborative rather than transactional, as if the agent and the woman of the house were working toward the same goal, which was the best possible biscuit, and the spry was the thing that made that goal more achievable. There were agents who did not last, and the reasons they did not last were consistent across accounts. They were agents who oversold, who pushed the product beyond what the demonstration supported, who claimed qualities for the shortening that the shortening did not consistently deliver, who treated the woman in the kitchen as a sale rather than as a practitioner. These agents created the experiences that eventually made American women wary of the house call in general, the sense that the person at the door was not there to help but to sell, which is a distinction that anyone who has spent time in a kitchen understands instinctively. By the 1960s, the home demonstration model was declining, not because the products had changed, though they had, and not because the kitchens had changed, though they had too. It was declining because the distribution of consumer goods had changed in a way that made the house call a less efficient delivery mechanism than the supermarket. The postwar supermarket, with its extensive product lines and its dedicated promotional shelf space, and its weekly circulars full of coupons, could reach more women in a week than a demonstration agent could reach in a year. The recipe card could be tucked into the box of shortening. The demonstration could be accomplished on the back of the can. The transaction could happen at the checkout rather than at the kitchen table. What was lost in this transition was the relationship. The woman who had bought spry from a demonstration agent who came to her house and made biscuits in her oven was not just buying shortening. She was buying the confidence that came from having been shown how to use it correctly by someone who knew her kitchen and her stove and her particular biscuit cutter. The woman who read the instructions on the can was doing something different. She was trusting the instructions on the can, which is a form of trust but a thinner one, less personal, less accountable, less able to diagnose what went wrong with the pie crust on the second try. The home demonstration agent was, among other things, a form of customer service that no supermarket ever fully replaced. She was the human interface between the product and the practice, and when she stopped coming to the door, the gap she left was not filled by anything as specific or as personal as she had been. It was filled by advertising, by the magazine recipe, by the advice column, by the television cooking show, all of which are forms of instruction that reach everyone the same way and therefore reach no one in particular. The shortening is still on the shelf, the biscuit recipe is still on the can, the kitchen is still there, and the woman in it still knows her oven better than anyone who has not cooked in it. But the demonstration agent is not coming on Thursday afternoon anymore. She drove away in her dark green Ford a long time ago, and she took the 12 minutes of oven heat and the specific conversation and the recipe card chosen for this particular kitchen with her, and what was left behind was simply the choice. Available to anyone, equally addressed to everyone, which is not quite the same thing as being addressed to you. The Home Economist was a figure of the post-war era who's been somewhat lost to the subsequent decades, but who was a genuine professional in the full sense of the word, someone trained in the sciences that undergirded domestic work, nutrition and chemistry, and food science and the physiology of cooking, and employed in a range of capacities that included not just the demonstration agent work, but also the test kitchens of food companies and the home economics departments of universities and the advisory roles at women's magazines, and the development of school curricula and the public extension services that operated out of land-grant universities and brought practical domestic knowledge to rural households through a network of county agents who drove their cars through the countryside and made house calls not so different in character from the demonstration agent's house call, except that the county agent was not selling anything. The County Home Extension Agent, a figure created by the Smith-Lever Act of 1914, was a government employee funded through the cooperation of the Federal Department of Agriculture and the state land-grant universities, whose purpose was to bring the practical results of agricultural and domestic science to households that would not otherwise have access to them. She travelled her county with information about nutrition and food preservation and child development and household management, and she held meetings at farmhouses and in church basements and school gymnasiums where women gathered to learn and to share what they had learned. The canning demonstrations that extension agents conducted through the 1930s, 40s and 50s were among their most consequential services, because home canning in this era was not a hobby, but a genuine food security strategy, and canning done in correctly produced food that could cause serious illness. The Clostridium botulinum bacterium, which produces the toxin responsible for botulism, thrives in the anaerobic environment of an improperly sealed jar and is not destroyed by temperatures below 240 degrees Fahrenheit. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. A temperature that boiling water cannot reach, and that requires a pressure canner to achieve in a home setting. Women who canned low-acid vegetables, beans and corn and meat in a water bath canner rather than a pressure canner were creating conditions that the botulism bacterium found comfortable, and the illness that resulted could be severe. The extension agent brought the science of this to kitchen tables across rural America, explaining the difference between high-acid and low-acid foods, and which could safely be processed in a water bath, and which required pressure canning, and then demonstrating the pressure canner in a way that removed the fear that many women had of a machine that operated under pressure, and that had, in the decades of its early use, occasionally failed in ways that were spectacular and dangerous. The extension agent's demonstration of the pressure canner was not just an instruction in technique, it was a trust-building exercise in a relationship between a government service and the women it was designed to serve. The food preservation knowledge that the extension service propagated through these decades is another layer of the hidden competence of the mid-century American kitchen, another body of skill and judgment that the Gleaming magazine kitchen never photographed because it was seasonal and practical and messy in the particular way of things that involve large quantities of wet produce and hot equipment, and the smell of vinegar and steam. 47-quart jars of tomatoes put up in August represents a serious investment of time and physical effort, and careful attention over the course of several days, and the result is a pantry that can feed a family through the winter in a way that the purchase cannot quite replicate, both in terms of the quality of the product and in terms of the knowledge that this family will eat, regardless of what the market does with its prices. The kitchen in the advertisement was always perfect. This requires acknowledgement before anything else, because the perfection was the point, and the point was not accidental. The gleaming stovetop, the spotless counter, the cheerful housewife in her crisply pressed apron, the refrigerator standing open to reveal its orderly contents, every item in its place, every jar labelled, every vegetable fresh and upright, the whole image composed with the careful staging of a magazine photographer who spent an hour arranging things and another half hour adjusting the lighting before the shutter clicked. The women who stood in those kitchens for those photographs were not the women who ran those kitchens. They were professional models, or they were the wives of company executives, or they were home economists hired by the appliance companies to serve as the public face of a domestic ideal that the companies were simultaneously creating and selling. They wore their aprons for the photograph and went home to their own kitchens, which looked nothing like the ones in the photographs, because no kitchen looked like the ones in the photographs, not even the ones in the photographs. This is the first hidden reality of the post-war American kitchen, the gap between the image and the room. The image was not a description, it was an aspiration, and aspirations are by definition things that have not been achieved yet. The second hidden reality followed directly from the first. The appliances in those gleaming kitchen photographs were presented as the means by which the aspiration could be achieved. Buy the refrigerator and your kitchen will look like this. Buy the range and your family will eat like this. Buy the dishwasher and you will have time to stand in your kitchen looking rested and pleased in the middle of the afternoon, because the dishwasher is doing the work that used to take 45 minutes of standing at the sink. What the photographs did not show, and what the advertisements did not mention, was that the acquisition of these appliances did not reduce the standard of domestic labour. It elevated it. This is what historians of American domesticity have called the paradox of labour-saving technology in the household, and it is a paradox that played out with particular clarity in the American kitchen between 1945 and 1970. The evidence for it is in the cookbooks. The cookbooks of the 1930s, written for households with iceboxes and hand tools and stoves that required monitoring, are books of substantial but bounded ambition. They assumed a kitchen that could produce good food reliably, and that the woman running it had physical limits and time constraints. The cookbooks of the 1950s and 1960s, written for households with electric refrigerators and stand mixers, and automatic ovens and eventually dishwashers, are books of considerably expanded expectation. More courses, more complex preparations, more frequent baking, more elaborate entertaining. The machine had made certain tasks faster, and the cultural response was to fill the available time with more tasks rather than fewer. The sociologist Ruth Schwartz Cowan documented this phenomenon with particular care in her 1983 book on the history of domestic technology, tracing how the introduction of labour-saving devices in the American home between the 1880s and the 1970s consistently failed to reduce the number of hours that women spent on domestic work. The hours stayed roughly constant. What changed was the standard of output. Cleaner houses, more varied meals, more frequent laundering, higher expectations at every point on the domestic spectrum. This was not a conspiracy. It was not designed by appliance manufacturers sitting in a room specifically plotting to ensure that the women who bought their products would always have enough work to do. It was the emergent result of a cultural system in which domestic labour was simultaneously undervalued and unrealistically idealised, in which the image of the perfect kitchen was used to sell products without any acknowledgement that the image was aspirational rather than descriptive, and in which the arrival of new tools consistently produced new standards rather than genuine relief. The kitchen itself was part of the system. The design of the post-war American kitchen, which became increasingly standardized through the 1950s and 1960s as suburban tract housing spread and kitchen layouts were replicated across thousands of identical houses, was designed around the idea of efficiency, and efficiency in this context meant the efficient production of domestic output by a single person. The work triangle, the concept promoted by home economists at Cornell University and elsewhere, arranged the stove, the sink and the refrigerator in a triangular configuration to minimize the number of steps required to move between them. This was a genuine practical improvement. It was also implicitly a design that assumed one person working alone. The design of the kitchen assumed the housewife. It assumed her presence, her singular responsibility, her trajectory through the space, her body's dimensions and reach, and daily routine. The kitchen was built for her in the way that a cell is built for an occupant, not as a prison, but as a space designed to contain and facilitate a specific kind of life. The efficiency it offered was the efficiency of a system optimized for one person doing one set of tasks repeatedly. It was not designed for sharing, not designed for negotiation, not designed for the possibility that the person doing the cooking might sometimes be someone other than the woman of the house. And yet, inside the perfect kitchen that the advertisements showed and the appliances were supposed to produce, the actual daily life was considerably more complicated, because kitchens are not machines. They are rooms where people live and eat and argue and cry and comfort each other and make decisions and avoid making decisions and run out of things they thought they had and find things they forgot they bought and occasionally produce meals of genuine beauty and more frequently produce meals that are adequate and warm and on the table by 6 o'clock, which is what was required of them. The hidden life of the post-war kitchen includes the things that the cheerful magazine photographs never captured. The burned roast that had to be supplemented with crackers and cheese while you pretended the dinner was smaller by design. The cake that fell and could not be served to guests and was eaten in slices over 3 days by the family, who were told it was a practice cake. The preserved tomatoes that you put up in August in 47-quart jars, and that 2 of them turned out to have sealed improperly, and that you threw away rather than risk them. The morning when the oven's thermostat gave out and you discovered it had been running 30 degrees hot for an unknown period of time, and you reconstructed how many things you had baked in the previous 6 weeks and could not fully account for all of them. The hidden life of the kitchen includes the economics that the advertisements never addressed, the careful management of a grocery budget that had room for Spry or Crisco but not both, and you chose based on what was on sale that week. the way you stretched a chicken across 3 days, roasted on Sunday, cold on Monday, soup on Tuesday, the way you used the fat skimmed from the soup to fry the potatoes on Wednesday, the way nothing was wasted in a household that could not afford the waste, even in years when the family was comfortable, because the memory of years when it was not was recent enough to govern the present. The hidden life of the kitchen includes the physical reality that no advertisement showed. A woman who stood on linoleum for 6 hours a day, who carried wet laundry and heavy pots, whose hands were in dishwater twice a day, and whose back registered the absence of a chair at the end of the day in specific and articulate terms, who was in the kitchen at 6 in the morning before the family woke up, and at 9 in the evening after the family went to bed, loading the percolator for the morning and wiping the counter and putting away the last of the dishes and turning off the kitchen light. There were also the chemical realities that would not become public knowledge for decades, the cleaning products that came in cheerful cans and bottles and that contained compounds now classified as harmful, which women used in enclosed spaces with inadequate ventilation because the labels were bright and reassuring and the advertisements showed women using them while smiling in well-lit kitchens with their windows apparently open. The pesticides used on produce that was not washed with anything like the thoroughness that would later be recommended. The lead paint on the kitchen walls that nobody thought about because lead in paint was not a public concern until the 1970s, and in the 1950s a freshly painted kitchen was simply a clean kitchen, a good kitchen, a kitchen that was being maintained properly. The aluminium cookware that most households used, the Miro pans and the club aluminum and the heavy Dutch ovens in matte grey, were not understood to present any health concern, and indeed, the evidence on the question remains contested in ways that mean it cannot be stated categorically either way. But the cast iron skillets that had been in families for generations, inherited from mothers and grandmothers who had cooked on wood stoves, were washed in ways the modern cast iron enthusiast would find catastrophic. Soaked sometimes, put through the dishwasher when the dishwasher arrived, stripped of their seasoning repeatedly and rebuilt, because the knowledge of how to care for cast iron was not transmitted consistently, and the women who knew it well were not always the women passing the skillets down. The hidden life of the kitchen includes the relationships that the gleaming photographs could not contain. The kitchen was where your mother-in-law sat at your table and told you, with the kindest possible intentions and the most devastating possible timing, that her son liked his eggs cooked differently, where your sister came to cry about her marriage, and you made tea and said the things you could say, and did not say the things you could not say, and cleaned up afterward because cleaning up was the thing you could always do. Where the neighbour who had too much to drink at the neighbourhood Christmas party sat down for coffee and stayed for 2 hours because her kitchen was where the argument had happened and she could not go back to it yet. The kitchen in the advertisement was a room. The kitchen in the house was a world. The difference between the two is the difference between a photograph of a place and the place itself, and that difference is everything. The appliance companies were not wrong that their products changed things. The refrigerator genuinely transformed food storage, reduced spoilage, made certain foods available year-round that had previously been seasonal, and eliminated the daily ice delivery that had been a feature of domestic life for generations. The electric range genuinely produced more consistent heat than the wood stove it replaced in many households, and consistent heat meant more predictable baking results, which is not a trivial improvement for a person whose baking failures mean hungry children or humiliated guests. The dishwasher genuinely did what it said it would do. But the transformation these appliances produced was a transformation in what was expected, not a transformation in how much was required. The kitchen remained the centre of the domestic world. The woman at its centre remained responsible for everything that the kitchen produced. The gleaming image of the perfect kitchen remained the standard against which every real kitchen was measured and found daily to fall short. And the woman who ran the kitchen learned to live in the gap between the image and the room. She learned to wipe down the stovetop before guests arrived. She learned to close the pantry door. She learned which things could be cleaned quickly if someone came to the door unexpectedly and which things required advance notice. She learned to make the imperfect kitchen look like the perfect one, or at least to make it look good enough, presentable enough, ordered enough to suggest that the person running it was in control of the situation. She almost always was. That was the part the advertisements never captured and never needed to because it was not a thing you could sell. The competence that kept the kitchen running was not a product. It was not purchasable. It was built from years of doing the thing, from failure and adjustment and trying again, from the accumulated knowledge of women teaching other women and daughters, watching mothers and grandmothers sitting at kitchen tables in the early morning when the house was quiet and the coffee was on, and the day had not yet made any demands. The hidden reality of the post-war American kitchen was that it ran. Not because of the appliances, though the appliances helped. Not because of the Spry or the Mixmaster or the Frigidaire or the recipe cards from the demonstration agent who came by on a Thursday afternoon. It ran because someone was in it, someone who knew how it ran and cared that it ran, and got up before the sun was fully committed to the day and put the coffee on and started the stove. That someone has never appeared in an advertisement. She was the one behind the camera, in a manner of speaking, the one making the conditions under which the gleaming image was possible. The photographs showed the kitchen, they did not show her. She was there anyway, she is always there. The gas itself was a hidden element of the post-war kitchen story that the advertisements for gas ranges never addressed, and that the women using those ranges understood only through the occasional smell that meant the pilot light had gone out, and through the company of men in uniform from the gas company who came once a year to check the connections, and who always said everything was fine. Natural gas in the American household, which became the dominant cooking fuel in most urban and suburban areas through the post-war decades, was not inherently dangerous if the equipment was maintained and the ventilation was adequate. But the ventilation in the post-war kitchen was frequently inadequate, and the equipment was maintained by the homeowner, who had received no training in the maintenance of gas appliances, and who relied on the company servicemen and on the appliance manual, which was written in the optimistic language of things that would not go wrong. The ventilation question in the post-war kitchen is worth considering alongside the chemical products that went into it. Range hoods were present in some kitchens, but far from all, and in the kitchens without them, the cooking combustion gases, the steam, the volatile organic compounds from the cleaning products, the off-gassing from the new synthetic materials in the flooring and the cabinetry. All of this accumulated in a room that was occupied for 6 to 8 hours a day by a person who was breathing it. The research on indoor air quality as a health concern did not exist in any organised form until the 1970s, and the specific risks of long-term exposure to cooking combustion in an inadequately ventilated kitchen did not become a subject of epidemiological study until later still. This is not to say that the kitchens were killing anyone obviously or quickly. The effects of indoor air quality on health are chronic rather than acute in most cases, the kind of effects that accumulate over decades and that look, when they eventually present, like other things, respiratory problems and headaches and the general category of not feeling quite right that medicine has always had difficulty attributing to specific causes. The women who spent their lives in these kitchens did not die dramatically of the kitchens. They lived their lives, long ones in many cases, in rooms that were less healthy than they might have been, without anyone telling them that this was so. The lead paint question overlaps with this. American residential paint contained significant amounts of lead, until the federal government began restricting lead content in residential paint in 1978, a date that is recent enough to mean that many houses built or repainted in the 1950s and 60s still carry lead paint on their walls, under the many subsequent layers that have been applied since. In 1955, a freshly painted kitchen in a bright, clean colour was a kitchen that was being maintained to the standard of the era. The lead in the paint was not a concern because it was not known to be a concern, because the research that would establish the relationship between lead exposure from paint in residential settings and harm to the people living in those settings was not yet complete and not yet public. The food itself carried hidden realities that the post-war era did not yet fully understand. The pesticide residues on produce, which had increased substantially with the widespread adoption of synthetic pesticides in American agriculture through the 1940s and 50s, were present on the vegetables and fruits that came into the kitchen from the market. The washing of produce in 1955 was a brief rinse under the tap, adequate by the standards of the time, not adequate by the standards of what was actually on the surface of the produce. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, would begin the public conversation about the chemical burden of American agriculture, but in the decade before that conversation, the pesticides were simply part of the air and the food and the water, invisible and untracked. The preservatives and additives that were increasingly present in processed and packaged foods through the post-war era were regulated by a framework that was not keeping pace with the rate at which new chemicals were being introduced into the food supply. The Food and Drug Administration of the 1950s was working with a regulatory structure built in a different era for a different food landscape, and the testing required before a chemical additive could be approved for use in food was not always commensurate with the scale and duration of the exposure that would result from approval. None of this was secret in the sense of being deliberately concealed by powerful interests, which is the narrative that the retrospective view sometimes imposes. Much of it was simply unknown, in the genuine sense of not having been studied sufficiently to produce conclusions that could inform policy or practice. The gap between what was happening and what was understood about what was happening is not always the result of bad faith. Sometimes it is simply the gap between a world that moves faster than the science that observes it. The kitchen's social hidden realities were of a different kind entirely. The gleaming post-war kitchen was presented as a space of domestic fulfillment, a room in which a woman could express her creativity and her competence, and her care for her family through the food she produced and the conditions she maintained. And for many women, this was true. The kitchen was a domain of genuine skill and genuine satisfaction, a place where the results of effort were immediate and tangible and appreciated. But the domestic ideal of the post-war era was also, and cannot be examined without acknowledging, a constraint. The kitchen was the room where women were expected to be, and the expectation carried the full weight of economic and social structure behind it. A woman who chose to work outside the home in the 1950s was choosing against a cultural norm that was enforced not through law in most cases, but through the more pervasive and difficult pressure of social disapproval, economic penalty, and the consistent messaging of every form of popular culture, from the television advertisements to the women's magazine feature to the home economics curriculum that prepared young women for domestic life as their primary vocation. The women who ran the post-war kitchen and who experienced it as a space of fulfillment and genuine competence were not wrong in their experience. The women who ran the same kitchen and experienced it as a confinement, a narrowing of possibility, a role imposed rather than chosen, were equally not wrong in their experience. Both were true simultaneously, in different kitchens, and sometimes in the same kitchen on different mornings. The domestic ideal of the post-war era was not a monolith any more than the women inside it were a monolith. What the advertisements carefully avoided was any acknowledgement of this complexity. The advertisements showed happy women in gleaming kitchens because unhappy women in imperfect kitchens did not sell appliances, or shortening or the particular vision of American domesticity that the post-war economy was built on. The image required its gloss. The gloss required the exclusion of everything that complicated it. And the thing about exclusions, in photography as in history, is that what is left out is as much a part of the picture as what is shown. The tired arm, the aching back, the burned roast, the biscuits that didn't rise, the woman at the sink at 9 in the evening who is done but not finished, who will go to bed and get up at 6 and do the whole thing again, who does this not because anyone told her it was what she wanted, but because this is what the kitchen requires, and the kitchen is hers and it will run because she runs it, and it will be clean because she cleans it, and the family will eat because she cooks. The advertisement never showed her, but she was there. She was always there. She is what the kitchen was, behind and beneath, and within the gleaming image that the advertisement constructed for the purposes of selling her something she would use to run the kitchen more efficiently so that she could run it more. The rule about the kitchen that no advertisement stated, and that every woman who ran one knew, was the rule of the perpetual beginning. A kitchen is never finished. It is always in some stage of the cycle, between meal and cleanup and meal, a cycle that has no end point and no rest except the small one at the end of the day after the last dish is done and the light is turned off. The advertisement showed a moment. The kitchen is not a moment. It is a continuous process, and the woman at the centre of that process is always somewhere in the middle of it. The Betty Crocker brand deserves particular examination in any discussion of the gap between the image of the post-war kitchen and its reality, because Betty Crocker was one of the most successful constructions of domestic aspiration in American commercial history. She was not a person. She was a name created by the Washburn Crosby Company, later General Mills, in 1921, chosen through a contest among women employees, and her signature was a composite created from the submissions of those employees. Her face, when she was eventually given one in 1936, was a composite too, assembled from the features of several women selected for the wholesome competence they projected. Betty Crocker spoke to American women through radio programs and cookbooks, and the Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook of 1950, which became one of the best-selling cookbooks in American history, and which presented the kitchen as a place of achievable mastery, cheerful possibility, and consistent results. The book was honest about technique, the recipes worked, the instructions were clear. But the Betty Crocker voice, the warm, encouraging, authoritative voice that addressed the reader as a friend and fellow kitchen practitioner, was the voice of an institution, not a person, optimized for exactly the effect it produced, which was trust. Women trusted Betty Crocker because Betty Crocker spoke to them in the way they wanted to be spoken to, as competent adults engaged in meaningful domestic work who deserved clear information and genuine respect. The fact that Betty Crocker did not exist, that she was a brand mascot rather than a practitioner, was generally known and generally not especially troubling, because the recipes worked, and the voice was helpful, and the kitchen did not require its guides to be flesh and blood, only to be useful. The women's magazines of the post-war era, Good Housekeeping and Ladies' Home Journal and Better Homes and Gardens and Woman's Day, performed a similar function to Betty Crocker, offering guidance and aspiration in a voice of experienced, practical friendship. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. What they also offered, in the pages between the recipes and the housekeeping advice and the fashion features, was advertising, a great deal of advertising, and the advertising was not always easy to disentangle from the editorial content in a way that made clear which was which. The Good Housekeeping seal of approval, which appeared on products that had been tested and approved by the magazine's test kitchens, was a form of editorial content that functioned as endorsement, a signal to readers that the magazine stood behind the product. The seal was genuine in the sense that the test kitchens were real, and the testing was conducted by real home economists who evaluated products against real standards. But it was also commercial in the sense that the seal was a business transaction between the magazine and the product manufacturer, and the products that could afford to pay for testing and approval were not always the products most relevant to the reader's actual needs. None of this was hidden precisely. The magazine's commercial relationships were not secret, but they were also not foregrounded, not made explicit in the way that would allow a reader to fully evaluate the independence of the endorsement she was receiving. The gap between the magazine's presentation of itself as a trusted guide and its actual function as a commercial enterprise that sold advertising and sold endorsements was a gap that most readers understood in the abstract, without examining in the specific case of any particular product recommendation. The practical consequence of all this aspiration and endorsement was that the standard of the post-war kitchen was set by commercial interests that had reasons to want that standard to be high, and to be achievable only through the purchase of specific products. The cleanliness of the gleaming stovetop required the correct stovetop cleaner. The perfect pie crust required the correct shortening. The birthday cake that rose perfectly required the correct baking powder, and the correct flour and the correct mixer to cream the butter and sugar to the right consistency. The kitchen was a market, and the market had representatives in every magazine and on every radio program, and eventually on every television show and in every advertisement, all of them speaking the language of domestic aspiration, and all of them offering, for a price, a piece of the image that the aspiration was built around. And the women in those kitchens bought what they could afford to buy, and made do with what they could not afford, and found workarounds for the things that the workarounds worked for, and lived with the things that had no workarounds, and ran the kitchen the way they had always run the kitchen, which was the way their mothers had run it, adjusted for the decade's materials and the family's resources and the particular demands of the life they were living. The kitchen that the advertisement never showed was the kitchen that actually fed the family, not the gleaming composite of aspiration, not the product of every endorsed appliance and approved shortening and test kitchen recipe, but the kitchen that worked with what it had, that produced meals out of the contents of the refrigerator and the pantry and the produce drawer and the knowledge of the person who knew what to do with them. That kitchen did not need a seal of approval. It needed heat and time and the practiced hands of the person who ran it. That person is the center of the story that this channel is always trying to tell, the person behind the gleaming image, the person inside the kitchen that no advertisement was built around, the person who got up before the sun and put the coffee on and started the stove and ran the thing from beginning to end every day, without being photographed or featured or endorsed or sealed or approved. She ran it because it needed to be run. because the family needed to eat, because the kitchen was there and she was there and the morning was there and the whole thing was waiting to begin again. She ran it and it ran and the family ate and the morning came again. And so tonight's journey through the kitchen comes to its end, the way the kitchen itself always ends its day, not with a dramatic finish, not with an announcement, but with the quiet completion of the last task and the turning off of the light. We spent this evening inside the 1950s kitchen, living through the rules that governed a Tuesday morning before a single pan was touched. We watched the coffee go on before the eggs. We learned why the egg bowl was only ever the egg bowl. We understood that calling the children once is the beginning and calling them twice is the signal, and going to the foot of the stairs is the last call, and that the difference between those three things is a system, and the system is the thing that holds the morning together. We followed the Mixmaster from its first appearance in a Depression-era hardware store display to the kitchen counters of a generation of women who would never again have to beat egg whites for 15 minutes with a hand rotary beater, and who, in the freedom that bought them, found new things to do with the time, new recipes to attempt, new standards to meet, because the ceiling on domestic ambition has never once in American history responded to a labour-saving device by coming down. We went out on the road with a woman who drives a sensible dark green Ford and carries a flat demonstration case and reads a kitchen in 15 seconds and knows that the sale is never really about the spry. It is about the biscuit. It is about sitting at someone else's kitchen table at 2:30 in the afternoon and letting 12 minutes of heat and flour and fat make the argument for you. And then staying quiet long enough for the argument to win. And we looked, carefully and without flinching, at the gap between the gleaming kitchen in the advertisement and the kitchen where the work actually happened. The burned roast, the improperly sealed tomatoes, the aching back at 9 in the evening when the last dish is done and the percolator is loaded for the morning. The woman who ran the kitchen and never appeared in the photograph of it. What connects all four of these stories is the same thing that connects every story this channel has ever told. The distance between the way things were presented and the way they were lived. The gap between the image that was sold and the reality that was managed daily by people who were doing the thing whether anyone was watching or not. The texture of ordinary life, which is almost always more demanding than its public image suggests, and almost always more interesting than its detractors allow. The kitchen that was running before sunrise in 1956 is not so different from the one running before sunrise today. The specific products have changed. The specific rules have softened. The specific technology has evolved in ways that neither the women at the demonstration nor the women in the advertisements would have anticipated. But the coffee still needs to go on first. The family still needs to eat. The kitchen still needs to be ready for the next thing. Always. The way it has always been, because that is what kitchens are for. Somewhere in a house that was built in 1947, on a street that still has its original trees, there is a kitchen where a woman got up this morning before the light came fully through the east window. She put the coffee on. She thought about what needed doing. She started the work. The kitchen ran. It always does. Let that be the last thing you carry with you into sleep tonight. The warm, particular knowledge that somewhere a kitchen is running, the stove is on, and the coffee has been made, and someone who knows exactly what she's doing is doing it, the way she does every morning quietly and completely before anyone else in the house is awake to see. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.